There is a pattern in history so consistent that once you see it, you can't unsee it. It doesn't appear in textbooks, it isn't mentioned in victory speeches, and it's rarely discussed on the news. Yet it affects your life more than almost any battle ever fought. The pattern always begins the same way. Tension rises. Headlines grow urgent. Maps fill the screen. Words like security, freedom, and existential threat dominate the conversation. You're told the moment is critical, that hesitation is dangerous, that cost is irrelevant because survival has no price. And while your attention is fixed on the war, on soldiers, missiles, and foreign leaders, something quieter begins to shift in the background. Money starts behaving differently. Not in a dramatic way, not all at once. At first, it feels harmless, a little more spending, a little more borrowing, emergency measures framed as temporary, deficits justified as necessary. You're told this is what responsibility looks like in a crisis, that we'll deal with the consequences later. And for a while, nothing seems wrong. Then the war ends, the fighting slows, the headlines move on, troops come home, parades are held, monuments are built, the nation exhales. And then, usually a year or two later, something breaks. Your grocery bill feels wrong, rent jumps faster than your paycheck, gas spikes without warning, savings that once felt solid begin to shrink in real terms. Life gets more expensive, not because you're doing anything differently, because the math underneath your money has changed. Most people experience this moment as confusion. They blame corporations, supply chains, bad luck, political incompetence. But inflation after war is not random. It is not accidental, and it is not a failure of the system. It is the system working exactly as designed. That is the part no one tells you. Every major war in modern history leaves behind the same financial footprint. Not because leaders are careless, not because mistakes were made, but because war creates a problem that has only a few possible solutions, and none of them are politically honest. Wars are far more expensive than people imagine, not just in lives or equipment, but in real economic terms. War consumes wealth, it doesn't create it. Steel becomes weapons instead of bridges. Fuel powers tanks instead of trucks. Factories stop producing goods people use and start producing things designed to be destroyed. This is not investment. It is consumption on a massive scale. And once that wealth is gone, it cannot be magically recovered. Someone has to pay for it. Here's the problem. Governments cannot pay for modern wars the way households pay for expenses. They cannot walk on television and say, this conflict will permanently reduce your standard of living, your savings will lose value, prices will rise for years, and future generations will carry the cost. If they said that, public support would collapse instantly. So they choose a different path. They borrow. They borrow on a scale that would be impossible in peacetime. Emergency budgets pass overnight. Trillions appear with minimal debate. Central banks step in to make the numbers work. Debt is painless in the moment. Inflation is not. So inflation is delayed. While the war is ongoing, governments work hard to suppress the symptoms. Prices are controlled. Subsidies are introduced. Shortages are hidden through rationing or reserves. The boiling pot is sealed, but the pressure inside continues to build. Because the money doesn't disappear just because you don't feel it yet. It accumulates. Debt piles up quietly. Currency supply expands. Claims on future production grow larger, even as real production is being destroyed by war. When the fighting stops, society tries to return to normal, but the balance sheet doesn't reset. This is the moment inflation is born.
Not when the first dollar is printed, not when the first bond is issued, but when suppressed reality collides with peacetime demand. Factories shift back to civilian goods. Soldiers return home with savings and expectations. Consumers rush to buy what they went without. And suddenly there is too much money chasing too few goods. Prices rise, not because businesses suddenly became greedy, not because markets broke, but because the war already consumed the wealth and the currency still pretends it exists. Inflation is how that contradiction is resolved. It is the delayed invoice for destruction that already happened. And history makes this painfully clear. After the American Civil War, prices surged as paper money flooded the economy. After World War I, European currencies collapsed under the weight of war debt. After World War II, the United States experienced one of the sharpest inflation spikes in its history. After Vietnam, inflation didn't just rise, it defined an entire decade. Different wars, different governments, different eras, same result. Because inflation is not a side effect of war. It is the least visible way to pay for it. Raising taxes enough to cover war costs would trigger revolt. Defaulting on debt would destroy credibility overnight. Inflation does something far more useful. It spreads the pain quietly, gradually, across millions of people. It reduces the real value of debt without declaring failure. It erodes savings without a vote. It transfers wealth without a line item. And perhaps most importantly, it hides responsibility. When inflation hits, there is no single moment to point to, no announcement, no official admission. It feels natural, inevitable, like bad weather. That illusion is its greatest strength. And once governments learn this lesson, they never forget it. Because inflation solves a political problem that has no clean solution. That is why it keeps happening. And that brings us to the uncomfortable realization at the center of this story. Inflation is not what happens when governments lose control after war. It is what happens when control is maintained. It is how impossible promises are honored without admitting they were impossible. And to understand just how intentional this mechanism is and why it has become almost impossible to reverse, we need to go back to the moment when money itself stopped being a restraint on power.
Because once you understand how war changed money, you'll understand why inflation keeps returning, and why this time may be different. To understand why inflation follows war so reliably, you have to understand a simple truth about modern conflict. Wars today are too large to be paid for honestly. For most of human history, war was limited by money in a very real way. If a king wanted to fight, he needed gold, silver, or immediate taxes. Armies were smaller, supply lines were shorter, and when the treasury ran dry, the war usually ended, not because of peace, but because it became impossible to continue. Money was a constraint. That changed in the 20th century, not because leaders became wiser, but because money itself changed. At the start of the 1900s, most major economies operated under systems that tied currency, at least loosely, to something physical. Gold, silver, or fixed exchange rules acted as a brake. You could only spend what you could back. This wasn't about morality, it was about arithmetic. And that arithmetic became a problem the moment industrial warfare arrived. Modern war consumes resources at a scale no vault can support. Steel isn't used by the ton, it's used by the trainload. Fuel isn't burned occasionally, it's burned continuously. Millions of workers must be paid. Supply chains must operate around the clock. Every day of war destroys more real wealth than most governments could ever tax directly.
So when large-scale war begins, the first casualty is almost always monetary restraint. Rules are suspended, convertibility disappears, emergency powers are invoked, central banks are told to do what's necessary. That phrase sounds technical. It isn't. It means this: create money faster than the economy can produce real goods. This is where the illusion begins. During the war, inflation often appears manageable. Prices are capped, goods are rationed, consumption is restricted. The public is told to sacrifice, and they usually do. On the surface, things look stable, but the money being created doesn't vanish just because it's temporarily contained. It accumulates. Debt grows quietly. Currency supply expands steadily. Claims on future production pile up, even as factories are diverted away from civilian needs. The economy is being hollowed out while the balance sheet grows. This imbalance is invisible during the emergency, but it doesn't disappear. It waits. The real problem begins when the war ends, because peace doesn't erase debt. Factories don't magically undo years of destruction. Lost productivity doesn't come back. Burned resources stay burned. Yet the money created to fund all of it is still there. This is the moment when inflation stops being theoretical. It becomes unavoidable. As controls are lifted, demand returns. People want what they postponed. Savings are spent. Credit flows again. And suddenly, reality asserts itself. Too much money, not enough goods. Prices rise, not because something broke, but because the system is reconciling a lie. The lie that the war could be paid for later. History gives us stark examples of what happens when this process runs unchecked. In the aftermath of the First World War, one major European nation made a decision that seemed logical at the time. Rather than raise taxes during the conflict, it chose to borrow nearly the entire cost of the war. The assumption was simple: victory would come quickly, and the defeated enemy would be forced to pay. While the war dragged on, money was printed to keep factories running and workers paid. Price controls masked the damage. On paper, stability remained. Then the war was lost. The expected reparations never arrived. Instead, new obligations appeared, and the currency that had been created during the war flooded into civilian life all at once. What followed wasn't chaos overnight. It was erosion. Savings lost value week by week. Pensions became meaningless. The middle class, the most financially disciplined group in society, was destroyed. This wasn't caused by recklessness or moral failure. It was arithmetic catching up. The war had already been paid for in real terms. Inflation was simply revealing who bore the cost. Most countries learned from this disaster, not by avoiding inflation, but by managing it more subtly. The lesson wasn't "don't do this," it was "never let it get that visible." After the Second World War, the same problem appeared in a more controlled form. The victorious nations emerged with enormous debts. Raising taxes enough to repay them would have crushed recovery. Defaulting would have shattered trust. So a quieter solution was chosen. Inflation was allowed to run above normal levels for years. Interest rates were kept artificially low. Savings earned less than prices rose. On paper, debts were honored. In reality, their value was reduced. This strategy had a name, though few people outside financial circles heard it: financial repression. It works by trapping savings inside a system where inflation slowly erodes them. No crisis, no headlines, no moment of accountability, just time. And it worked. Governments reduced wartime debt without riots or defaults. Citizens paid the bill gradually, often without realizing it. Once this mechanism proved effective, it became impossible to unlearn, because it solved an insoluble political problem. Borrow now, inflate later. Let time do the work. Every major conflict reinforced the same precedent. Wars got larger, spending increased, debt became permanent. Inflation stopped being an aftermath and started becoming a feature. But there is a crucial detail that makes the modern era different. Earlier wars were followed by periods of rebuilding. Factories returned to civilian use, productivity surged, population growth was strong. Those forces helped absorb inflation over time. Today, those buffers are weaker. Modern economies are already heavily leveraged. Populations are aging, growth is slower, and wars are no longer isolated events. They overlap, they persist, they never fully end. This is why inflation today feels different, not sharp and temporary, but sticky, persistent, structural. Because the system is no longer resetting between crises, it's compounding them. And money, once the constraint on power, has become its enabler. Instead of saying no, it stretches.
And the further it stretches, the harder it becomes to pull back. This is the point where inflation stops being a technical issue and starts becoming something more dangerous. Because once people realize that money will always be used to smooth over impossible promises, they change how they behave. And when behavior changes, inflation enters a new phase. That is where this story goes next. If inflation were only about printing money, the solution would be simple. Stop printing, raise interest rates, restore discipline. That story is comforting. It's also incomplete. Because wars don't just damage balance sheets, they permanently reshape the physical structure of the economy, how things are made, how they move, and how expensive everything becomes. And once that structure changes, inflation stops being temporary. It becomes structural. To understand why, we need to talk about a period most people now take for granted. For nearly 30 years, the global economy benefited from something extraordinary. After the Cold War ended, the world entered a rare window of cooperation. Borders opened, trade expanded, supply chains stretched across continents in search of efficiency. Production went where labor was cheapest. Energy came from where it was most abundant. Goods were delivered exactly when needed. This system wasn't built for resilience. It was built for cost. And it worked. Prices stayed low even as governments borrowed aggressively. Central banks expanded balance sheets, yet inflation remained muted. Why? Because globalization absorbed the pressure. Cheap labor, cheap energy, frictionless trade. These forces acted like a shock absorber. They masked the inflationary consequences of debt. This was the peace dividend. War destroys that dividend. Not instantly, not dramatically, but decisively. Every major conflict forces nations to reassess their dependencies. What once looked like efficiency starts to look like vulnerability. A supplier becomes a rival. A trade route becomes a risk. A resource becomes a bargaining chip. Security replaces cost as the priority. And security is expensive. When a country decides it can no longer rely on the cheapest producer because that producer might become an enemy, it chooses a more expensive alternative. When shipping lanes become dangerous, routes get longer, insurance costs rise, delays multiply. When sanctions are imposed, entire categories of supply disappear overnight. None of this is theoretical. Energy offers the clearest example. For decades, parts of the world structured their economies around abundant, inexpensive energy delivered through stable relationships. It was efficient. It lowered costs across manufacturing, transportation, and food. When conflict shattered those relationships, the replacement wasn't cheaper. It was dramatically more expensive. Energy had to be transformed, shipped across oceans, and rebuilt at the destination. Every step added cost. That cost didn't stay in the energy sector. It flowed through everything. Electricity bills, factory output, transportation, groceries. This wasn't mismanagement. It was math. And energy is only one piece of the puzzle.
Modern wars increasingly target economies rather than armies. Sanctions, embargoes, asset freezes, and trade restrictions are now primary weapons. They are designed to disrupt supply, not seize territory.
But supply doesn't vanish cleanly. When major producers are cut off, global markets tighten. Scarcity rises. Prices rise everywhere, including in the countries imposing the sanctions. This is the hidden cost of economic warfare. You don't just hurt your opponent, you tax yourself. And when multiple conflicts overlap, the effect compounds. Shipping avoids entire regions. Delivery times stretch. Inventories grow. Efficiency collapses. The global machine that once delivered cheap goods grinds down. This is the moment inflation stops being cyclical because the system itself is no longer optimized for affordability. It's optimized for survival. There is another force pushing prices higher, and it's even harder to reverse. In a war-driven world, governments become the most aggressive buyers in the economy. They don't negotiate. They don't wait. They don't cut back when prices rise. They buy what they need, when they need it, at almost any cost. Steel, fuel, technology, labor, capital, all are pulled toward military and strategic priorities. Economists call this crowding out. In plain terms, when the government consumes more, everyone else gets less. Scarcity spreads. Prices rise. In earlier wars, this was obvious. Civilian production stopped. Factories were converted. Consumer choice vanished. Today, it's more subtle. You can still buy a car. You can still build a house. You can still start a business. But everything costs more. Materials are scarcer. Labor is tighter. Financing is more expensive. And the competition isn't just other consumers. It's governments with unlimited budgets and central banks behind them. This is why inflation after modern wars is so persistent. Even when central banks raise interest rates, they're fighting physical constraints. You can't rate hike your way to cheap energy. You can't tighten policy into shorter supply chains. You can't print efficiency. And there's one more factor that makes this era different from the past. Debt. Not elevated debt, extreme debt. Governments today aren't recovering from a single war. They're managing the accumulated cost of decades of conflict layered on top of aging populations, entitlement promises, and slowing growth. In earlier periods, inflation could be crushed by force. Interest rates could be raised until demand broke. That cure worked because the patient was strong enough to survive it. Today, that same cure threatens the patient. When debt levels are this high, high interest rates don't just slow growth, they destabilize the state. Servicing costs explode, deficits widen, political pressure mounts. This creates a trap. Inflation is painful, but fighting inflation aggressively becomes impossible. So policymakers compromise. They talk tough, they move cautiously, they tolerate higher inflation as the price of stability. And over time, that tolerance becomes policy. This is the turning point, the moment when inflation stops being treated as an emergency and starts being treated as an environment. Not ideal, not celebrated, but accepted. And when that happens, something even more important changes. People notice, they adjust. And once behavior changes, inflation enters its most dangerous phase. Because money doesn't just lose value mechanically, it loses meaning psychologically. That shift is subtle at first, but it is irreversible once it takes hold. And that's where this story leads next. Inflation becomes truly dangerous not when prices rise, but when belief changes. For most of modern history, money worked because people trusted it. Not perfectly, not blindly, but enough. A paycheck earned today was assumed to hold its value tomorrow. Saving made sense. Planning made sense. Delaying gratification made sense. That trust is the foundation of a stable economy. War quietly erodes it.
not overnight, not through announcements, but through signals. When a nation enters prolonged conflict, especially one framed as existential, the rules change. Balanced budgets become optional. Debt limits become flexible. Emergency powers become permanent. The message is subtle but clear. Winning matters more than solvency. And once people sense that shift, their behavior adapts. At first, it looks rational. If prices are rising, you buy sooner rather than later. If cash is losing value, you look for alternatives. If debt is being inflated away, borrowing feels safer than saving. Individually, these choices make sense. Collectively, they change everything. This is the psychological engine of inflation. Economists call it the velocity of money. In simple terms, it's how fast money moves from hand to hand. When trust is high, money moves slowly. People save, they wait, they plan. When trust weakens, money speeds up. People spend faster. They convert cash into assets. They try to outrun depreciation. And when millions of people act this way at once, inflation feeds on itself. Even if governments slow money creation, prices keep rising because behavior has changed. This is why inflation can feel unstoppable long after policymakers say it's under control. The problem is no longer mechanical, it's psychological. History has seen this pattern before. In the 1970s, inflation wasn't just high, it was embedded in expectations. Workers demanded higher wages because they assumed prices would rise. Businesses raised prices preemptively. Savers abandoned cash. Money stopped being a neutral medium. It became something to get rid of. Restoring trust required extreme measures. Interest rates were pushed to painful levels. Recessions followed. Unemployment surged. The pain was concentrated and undeniable. That shock worked then for one reason. Debt was manageable. Governments could afford high rates. Budgets could absorb the cost. The system could survive the cure. Today, that option barely exists. Modern debt levels change the equation entirely. Raising interest rates high enough to crush inflation would also crush government finances. Debt servicing costs would explode. Deficits would spiral. Political pressure would become unbearable. This creates a credibility problem. People sense that discipline will not return easily. They sense that inflation will be tolerated. And once that belief takes hold, behavior adjusts permanently. Saving in cash becomes irrational. Long-term planning becomes harder. Risk shifts from institutions to individuals. This is how inflation becomes entrenched, not because policymakers want it to persist, but because reversing it becomes more damaging than living with it. And the psychological impact doesn't stop at national borders. It spills into the global system. For decades, one currency sat at the center of global finance. It wasn't perfect, but it was predictable.
It was used for trade, reserves, contracts, and commodities. That status created enormous demand, and demand absorbed excess supply. This allowed one country to borrow cheaply, run deficits, and export inflation rather than import it. War changed that. When financial systems become weapons, trust erodes. Asset freezes, sanctions, exclusions from payment networks. These actions send a message. Money is no longer neutral. For countries watching from the sidelines, the response is obvious. Reduce exposure, diversify reserves, build alternatives. This isn't ideology, it's risk management. When global demand for a dominant currency weakens, those units don't disappear. They come home. They circulate domestically instead of being absorbed abroad. This shift is inflationary by nature. For years, excess money flowed outward in exchange for cheap goods. Now, that flow is reversing. Goods are scarcer. Currency is abundant. Prices adjust. This is the empire tax. The moment when the privilege of issuing global money begins to fade and the cost is paid internally. War accelerates this process. Neutrality becomes difficult. Trade becomes political. Efficiency becomes suspicious. Every fracture adds friction. Every friction adds cost. Every cost shows up in prices. And beneath all of this is a deeper truth. Empires rarely collapse from invasion. They collapse from maintenance costs, from trying to sustain security, influence, and control beyond what their productive base can support. When that gap widens, something has to absorb the pressure. Taxes provoke revolt. Defaults destroy credibility, so currencies absorb it instead. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. Ancient states diluted metal content to stretch resources. Modern ones expand balance sheets. The mechanism changes. The outcome doesn't. Money weakens so power can persist. And once that trade-off is accepted, inflation stops being temporary. It becomes an environment. People adapt. Institutions adapt. Expectations adjust. Society quietly crosses a line from preserving wealth to managing decline. Not collapse, not chaos, just a steady narrowing of options. And that brings us to the final question. What does this mean for the future? Because inflation after war is not just a historical pattern, it's a signal. A signal that stability is no longer affordable. And once that signal is sent, the system rarely returns to the way it was. That is where this story ends. Every generation wants to believe that its crises are temporary, that once the war ends, once the emergency passes, once the situation stabilizes, things will return to normal. Prices will settle, trust will recover, the system will reset. History offers a harder lesson. What history shows is that inflation after war is not a phase, it is a verdict. A quiet admission that more wealth was consumed than can ever be replaced. War doesn't just destroy cities or lives, it destroys future possibilities. It pulls consumption forward. It burns resources meant for tomorrow. It leaves behind obligations that can only be honored in name. Inflation is how societies pretend those obligations were met. Empires throughout history faced the same dilemma. They expanded influence faster than they expanded production. They committed to defense, security, and control beyond what their economies could sustain. When the gap became too large, something had to give. Rarely was it power. More often, it was money. In ancient times, this meant reducing the precious metal content of coins. Money still circulated, contracts were still honored, the system appeared intact, but value thinned until trust finally broke. Modern systems are no different. They're cleaner, digital, abstract. Instead of clipping coins, balance sheets expand. Instead of melting silver, purchasing power erodes invisibly. Instead of debasement by decree, it happens through policy. The result is the same. Inflation is the modern expression of imperial overstretch. It allows governments to avoid immediate collapse while transferring the cost of ambition onto the public over time. It is politically survivable precisely because it feels impersonal. No one sends you a bill labeled war expense. You feel it elsewhere, at the grocery store, in housing, in healthcare, in retirement. This is why inflation persists long after the fighting stops, because the war didn't really end, it changed form. Military spending becomes permanent, security priorities harden, rivalries replace cooperation, the economy reorganizes around readiness rather than prosperity. And once that happens, old assumptions no longer apply. Low inflation requires peace. It requires trust. It requires excess capacity. It requires cooperation. War destroys all four. That's why promises of a quick return to normal ring hollow.
Normal was a product of a specific historical window. That window has closed. This doesn't mean collapse is imminent. Decline is often slow, uneven, and survivable. But it does mean the rules have changed. Saving in cash becomes a losing strategy. Long-term planning becomes harder. Risk shifts from institutions to individuals. Inflation becomes the environment rather than the exception. And this is the part most people miss. Inflation is now doing work policymakers are unwilling to do openly. It is reducing debt in real terms. It is reshaping promises that can't be kept. It is rationing consumption without votes. It is forcing adjustment without accountability. It is decline disguised as stability. Once you see inflation this way, your perspective changes. You stop asking when prices will come down. You start asking why they're allowed to stay up. You stop listening to reassurances. You start watching incentives. Because no government chooses inflation over stability unless stability is no longer affordable. That is the final secret. Inflation follows war because war consumes more than society can replace, and inflation is the only way to reconcile that reality without admitting failure. It is the cost of ambition, the price of power, the tax that arrives after the flags are folded and the speeches end. And once it begins, it rarely ends the way people hope. The war fades from memory, but the inflation it created becomes background noise, a constant reminder that nothing is ever truly paid for at the moment it's purchased, only later by someone else with money that buys less than it should. That is the real aftermath of war, and if history is any guide, we are still early. If this changed how you think about inflation, you might want to understand the other tools governments use when money alone isn't enough. That story comes next.